Winter rose slowly over Wicker's Hollow, a pale hush settling over the wooden roofs as if the whole town were caught between breaths. The first light of dawn was the color of cold porcelain, thin and trembling, and it washed over the small figure making her way down the frost-crusted path. Elara Wynne walked with the kind of careful steps that belonged to children, who had learned to move through the world without disturbing it. Her scarf frayed, sky blue trailed behind her like a soft ribbon of forgotten summer, fluttering each time the wind decided to remind her how small she was in the great, endless winter. She wasn't out there hunting for wonder, though she often wished she were. She was simply moving because the silence inside her home hurt more than the cold. Her mother had barely spoken the night before, and when she did, her voice carried the weary brittleness of someone who'd run out of places to store sorrow. So Elara wandered, letting the crisp air sting her cheeks because pain from the outside was easier to understand than the ache blooming in her chest. A faint whimper tugged her from her thoughts. She stopped. The sound came again, thinner this time, like something trying not to be heard. Elara followed it around the back of the broken water trough near old Mercer's barn, where the wind carved icy ribbons along the ground. Nestled in the shadowed hollow were two dogs more bone than furcled so tightly together. They could have passed for a single creature. Frost clung like white dust to their muzzles. One lifted its head at her approach, eyes cloudy with fear and cold. The other didn't even manage that much. It only trembled. Elara knelt, the frost biting at her knees. "It's all right," she murmured, though she had no idea if it truly was. Her breath clouded between them like a fragile veil. She reached out slowly, letting them sniff her knuckles. The dog with open eyes took in her scent, hesitated, then nudged her hand weakly. Trust, just the smallest flicker of it, moved between them like a prayer. "You're freezing," she whispered. "You'll die out here." The decision wasn't a decision at all. She unbuttoned her coat, draped it over the dogs, and gathered them against her with clumsy, determined arms. They were heavier than she expected, and the cold in their bodies soaked instantly into her own. But she kept walking one slow step, then another toward home, inside. Her breath still shaking from the effort, she announced, "Mama, they needed me." Myra Larkspur stood by the dying stove, a mug of untouched coffee, growing cold on the counter. Shadows pooled beneath her eyes, the kind that grief etches so deep they become part of a person's bone structure. She turned at the sound of Elara's voice, saw the bundle of shivering fur in her arms, and stiffened. "Elara." The name came out like a sigh that had lost its way. "We can't these things, they're not things," Elara said softly, though her voice quavered. "They were freezing." Mira rubbed her forehead, as if smoothing out a headache. She wasn't a cruel woman, only a tired one. But exhaustion has a sharp edge, and sometimes it cuts the gentlest hearts first. "We don't need more problems," she whispered. "The town already thinks whatever thoughts followed were swallowed by silence." Mira turned away. Elara lowered her eyes, an old shame tightening around her ribcage. But she carried the dogs to the fireplace anyway, arranging blankets and urging the flames to rise higher. The dogs lay still for several heartbeats, so still she wondered if she'd been latent, till one let out a rough, grateful sigh. In school that day, whispers trailed her like a cold draft she couldn't escape. Mrs. Kindle had been busy spreading stories before sunrise. Of course she had. Elara heard one group of children say the dogs were dangerous strays. Another said she'd stolen them from someone important. A boy muttered that animals like that only brought trouble. Elara lowered her gaze, tracing small circles in the dirt with the toe of her boot, pretending she didn't feel every word landing on her like sleet. But Jonah Reed didn't join the others. He walked past the crowd without a glance, then slowed as he crossed in front of her. Their eyes met, brief, quiet, steady. His nod was almost invisible, but it warmed something inside her that had been cold for far too long. When she returned home, the dogs lifted their heads weakly at the sound of her steps. Their tails beat the air just once, but it was enough. She knelt, stroking the ridge of their spines, feeling the tremor beneath their skin. She named them Frost and Bramble, though she didn't say the names aloud yet. Names felt like promises, and she wasn't sure if she was allowed to make any later that evening. Jonah appeared at her porch with a loaf of warm bread wrapped in cloth. He said nothing at first, and she didn't ask why he'd come. They simply sat on the porch steps, sharing the bread in small, quiet bites, while Frost and Bramble dozed beside them. The snow fell in slow spirals around the lantern hanging by the door, painting the world in soft motion. Jonah pulled his scarf looser and accidentally brushed her shoulder. She didn't move away. Their silence wasn't awkward, it was a bridge. When he finally rose to leave, Lee placed a hand on the porch railing and murmured, "Keep them warm tonight. It's gonna freeze harder than before." Then he vanished down the path, his figure nearly swallowed by the drifting snow. Hours later, long after Elara had tucked the dogs into blankets and watched frost crystals gather on the window pane, she heard something outside, something that didn't belong to the wind. A faint crunching, a pause. Then another crunch, closer this time. Her breath hitched. She peered through the window, but saw only darkness and the faint reflection of her own worried face. The dogs stirred uneasily, their ears pricking. Bramble whined, low and uncertain. Elara backed away from the window, wishing Jonah were still near enough to whisper, "It's probably nothing." She lit a lantern and set it beside her bed just as he'd suggested earlier. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, but couldn't completely quiet the uneasy feeling coiling in her stomach. Eventually, sleep tugged her downward, gentle but persistent. She curled beside the dogs, drawing comfort from their warmth, letting their steady breathing lull her toward dreams. Outside, the winter deepened. Inside, the lantern flickered softly, casting amber ripples across the walls like whispers of a fragile hope. She woke before dawn to a sound that didn't belong to any dream, boots many of them crushing brittle frost. Low voices murmuring, sharp with urgency. The heavy click of a rifle being readied. Then a fist struck the door hard enough to shake the frame. Elara win. Another slam. "Open up." The dogs pressed against her legs, trembling again, not cold now, but fear. Elara stood frozen in the hazy blue light of early morning, her heart pounding with a sound that felt far too loud for such a small chest. Outside, someone shouted orders. Inside, the air held its breath, and as Elara stepped toward the door, the winter seemed to lean closer, listening. The pounding on the door shook the thin wooden walls, each strike reverberating through the small home like a warning meant for someone far older than Elara. Frost and Bramble huddled against her, their bodies quivering with a fear that rippled into her bones. Mira rushed from her room, hair unbound and eyes wide with a panic Elara had not seen since the night her father never came home. Before either of them could speak, the door splintered open under the force of the final blow. Cold morning air spilled into the house, along with half a dozen lawmen. Sheriff Alden Crow stepped forward first, boots heavy with authority, his breath a plume of white that made him look carved from winter itself. Behind him stood Marshal Thorne Calder, quieter, older, his presence less like an intrusion and more like a weight settling into a familiar chair. Crow's gaze swept the room until it landed on the dogs. His jaw tightened. "There they are," he said, voice clipped. "The strays involved in last night's incident." Elara instinctively stepped in front of Frost and Bramble, her small frame standing like a fragile barrier. "They didn't do anything," she managed, though her throat constricted around the words. Crow barely glanced at her. "Child, you don't understand. These animals are evidence. They must be taken." Mira moved to Elara's side, hands trembling. "Sheriff, there must be a mistake. They were freezing when she found them half dead. Now they're half dangers," Crow snapped. But Thorne Calder was watching something else, the dog's posture. The panic in their eyes, the instinctive way they leaned toward Elara as if she were the only warm thing left in the room. He knelt, ignoring Crow's irritated glance, and extended a hand. Bramble sniffed it, then nudged his palm with a wary acceptance that spoke of quiet desperation rather than aggression. "These animals aren't violent," Thorne murmured. "They're scared." Crow scoffed. "They were found near the Calderon Ranch right after the attack. That alone is reason enough." Thorn shook his head slowly. Or it means they ran from whatever truly happened. Elara clutched the dogs closer. Something in Thorn's gaze, steady, gentle, made her feel seen. As though he understood a truth no one else had bothered to consider, that kindness, not fear, had led her to this moment. Crow ordered his men forward. The dogs whimpered, shrinking behind Elara. One deputy reached out. And Frost growled not a threat, but a terrified warning. Elara flinched at the sound. It was the first time she'd heard the dog make anything loud. "Stop," Thorn said sharply. "Let the girl speak." Crow spun toward him. "Marshal, this is my jurisdiction. I'm here because what happened last night wasn't simple," Thorn replied, standing. "Let her speak." Elara swallowed hard. She felt Mira's hand slip into hers, the smallest gesture, but one that felt like a bridge across years of distance. "I found them near old Mercer's barn," she began. "They were freezing. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They just wanted warmth." Crow opened his mouth, but Thorn lifted a hand. "Let her finish." She took a breath that quivered through her. "When I touched them, they didn't bite. They didn't fight. They followed me because they didn't want to die alone." Silence fell heavy. Trembling and Thorn crouched again, gently examining the dogs' necks. When he lifted their fur, everyone stared. Scars, ragged, healed badly. Marks that spoke of ropes tightened too long, collars never loosened. Hands that took more than they ever gave. These dogs weren't attackers, Thorn said quietly. They were victims. A simmering tension thickened in the doorway as another figure approached broad-shouldered, smelling of old smoke and anger. The rancher. His face was red with fury, breath visible in the cold. "There's my property," he growled. "You got no right keeping them." Lara's stomach dropped. Frost pressed closer. Whimpering, Thorn stood between the rancher and the dogs with a calm that only made the rancher angrier. "They've been abused. They're animals," the rancher spat. "Mine." "Not anymore," Thorn said. "Not after what you did." Crow hesitated, caught between law and truth, between habit and conscience. He shifted uneasily, but said nothing. The rancher stepped forward, towering. "Move aside." "No," Thorn replied, voice low but immovable. The rancher lunged. Bramble leaped without thinking. Not in aggression, but in protection, placing himself between Elara and the man's swinging arm. The rancher stumbled, startled, and in that heartbeat of imbalance, Thorn moved not with violence, but with precision. He caught the rancher's wrist, twisted it behind him, and shoved him down to his knees in one smooth motion. The house filled with the sound of the rancher's breath leaving him. A harsh grunt swallowed by the cold. Crow finally reacted, stepping forward as if waking from a long sleep. "We'll take him in," he muttered. But the conviction in his voice had cracked. Thorn released the rancher only when he was restrained by his men, then turned back to Elara. She expected anger, or a disappointment, or an adult's weary lecture, but instead found something like respect softening his features. "You protected them," he said, "and they protected you." Mira pulled Elara gently into her arms, the embrace hesitant at first, then tightening in a way that made Elara's throat ache with quiet longing. She had forgotten what it felt like to be held like that, like she mattered. Neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion. Their murmurs, once sharp with suspicion, shifted as Thorn explained what the dogs had endured. For the first time, the town looked at Elara not with doubts, but with a dawning understanding. Thorn issued the decision before Crow could muster another argument. "These dogs stay with the Wynn family. They'll be safe here." Mira's hand found Elara's shoulder, squeezing softly. "We'll take care of them," she said. And the dogs pressed their heads against her side as if they'd heard a promise. The rest of the morning moved, like thawing ice slow, steady, revealing layers that had been hidden beneath cold for too long. Jonah appeared near the porch, breath misting in the air, eyes flicking apologetically toward Elara, as if he'd wanted to help sooner, but hadn't known how. When she stepped outside, he offered her his gloves without a word. She slipped them on, feeling warmth not just from the wool, but from the gesture itself. By afternoon, the rancher was hauled away, the deputies dispersing across snow-covered streets. Crow left with a troubled expression, perhaps reconsidering the shape of justice. Thorn lingered near the edge of the yard, watching Elara with the dogs as if committing the scene to memory. Sometimes he said quietly as he passed her, "The smallest kindness changes more than we think." Elara didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Winter loosened its grip slightly as days passed. Frost and Bramble grew stronger, their coats thickening, their eyes brightening with a trust they didn't give lightly. Mira began leaving the door open a little longer when Elara returned from school. Jonah visited more often, sometimes with warm bread, sometimes with nothing but his quiet company. Elara walked through Wicker's Hollow with the dogs beside her, their steps leaving careful imprints in the thawing snow. People didn't whisper anymore. Some even smiled. One evening, as the sky blushed pink above the frozen fields, Elara paused beneath the old lantern outside her home. Frost and Bramble curled beside her feet, Jonah leaning against the railing with his hands tucked into his coat. The world felt soft in a way she hadn't known it could be. She looked up at the sky, breathing in the cold air that no longer stung as sharply, and felt something warm bloom inside her. A small, steady flame. Kindness had saved 2 lives. Courage had saved her own. And love, quiet, patient, slow as winter melts, was beginning to fill the spaces that once felt empty. If this whispered tale touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe for more stories carried gently through the cold.